The cost of government debt, from crisis to zero and back again. Coverage period, August 2008 to August 2026. Flint West reporting. Summary statement. The post-GFC era was built on the extraordinary suppression of sovereign borrowing costs. Investors surrendered yield, currencies absorbed the consequences of monetary expansion, and governments enjoyed nearly 2 decades of unusually cheap financing. That regime has now reversed. Bond investors want their money back, and unfortunately for governments, they want interest on it. Section 1. Take a look at the chart. August 2008, right before the global financial crisis detonated, government debt still had something resembling a normal price. Then the system broke. Capital ran into sovereign bonds. Central banks cut rates to the floor. Quantitative easing arrived. Government borrowing costs collapsed. And what started as emergency medicine became the monetary architecture of the next 15 years. There was one obvious winner: fiscal sustainability. Governments discovered they could borrow enormous amounts of money at extraordinarily low rates. Central bank balance sheets expanded. Policy rates went to zero. In parts of Europe and Japan, government bonds went through zero. Think about that. Investors were effectively being asked to lend money to governments for years, sometimes decades, for almost nothing, and sometimes for less than nothing. Section 2. So there was an obvious loser too: investor returns. Savers got squeezed. Pension funds got squeezed. Insurers got squeezed. Bondholders got squeezed. And once inflation was included, plenty of investors were locking in negative real returns. That was financial repression in practical form. Suppress the price of capital, stabilize the financial system, and make an enormous sovereign debt burden easier to carry. And here's the important part: it didn't go away. By December 2019, more than a decade after the financial crisis, the U.S. 10-year Treasury was still only around 1.9%. Britain was around 0.8%. France was barely above zero. Japan was still negative. The emergency had become the regime. Then COVID arrived, and we did it all again, only bigger. Massive fiscal expansion, massive central bank intervention, another collapse in sovereign yields, and government borrowing costs pushed toward their ultimate floor. But this time, the third player in the game started banging on the door. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 3. Purchasing power. Because there are 3 constituencies here, and everybody wants something. Governments want fiscal sustainability. They want borrowing costs low enough to keep the debt serviceable. Currency holders want purchasing power. They want their money to retain its claim on actual goods, services, and assets. And investors want investor returns. They want to be compensated for inflation, duration, and sovereign risk. There's your policy trilemma. And for most of the post-GFC era, fiscal sustainability was winning. Governments were getting cheap money, investors were getting shafted, and purchasing power appeared, at least initially, to be holding together. Then inflation arrived, and suddenly the third corner of the triangle wasn't so quiet anymore. Now look at 2026. The tables have turned. The US 10-year has recently touched roughly 4.7%. The 30-year pushed above 5.3% before retreating. Japan's 10-year has reached roughly 2.9%, territory Japan hasn't seen for decades. China is the conspicuous exception, with its 10-year moving down toward 1.7% amid weak domestic credit demand. But across much of the developed world, the message from the bond market is becoming increasingly difficult to misunderstand. You want our capital? You're going to pay for it. And that's the reversal. For nearly 2 decades, the fiscal sustainability class was extracting its advantage from the investor returns class. Now the investor returns class is reaching across the table and pulling as much yield as it can out of the fiscal sustainability class. They're taking some of it back. Section 4. But there's a problem. The debt came with us. That's the part that matters. You can take government bond yields back toward 2008 levels, but you cannot magically take government debt back to 2008 levels with them. And those are 2 very different worlds. A sovereign carrying 4 or 5% borrowing costs against the debt structure of 2008 is one thing. A sovereign carrying those same rates after another 18 years of accumulated borrowing is something else entirely. So now purchasing power is stuck in the middle. Push yields back down aggressively enough to rescue fiscal sustainability, while inflation remains troublesome, and somebody has to absorb that monetary accommodation, quite possibly the currency. Defend purchasing power with restrictive monetary conditions, and governments have to swallow higher refinancing costs. Let the bond market determine the return investors actually demand, and fiscal sustainability starts taking the beating. Pick your constituency, because somebody pays. And that's what this chart is really showing you. It isn't just a history of government bond yields. It's a history of who was being asked to pick up the tab. Section 5. After 2008, investors paid through suppressed returns. After COVID, currency holders increasingly paid through diminished purchasing power. And now, the bill is moving back toward the sovereign borrower. Which brings us to the number that matters most. Not 4.7%, not 5%, not even 5.3%. The remarkable thing about 2026 isn't simply that sovereign yields have climbed back toward the levels we associated with the world before the global financial crisis. It's that yields have returned toward 2008 levels, without debt returning to 2008 levels. Same neighborhood in yields. Very different neighborhood in debt. And that is why the struggle between fiscal sustainability, purchasing power, and investor returns is only getting started. Flint West signing off.